If last week's OTA was prime rib, this one feels a little bit more like the dollar menu. Now, I don't want to devalue it too much. I think it's a good thing that after a big change, they don't immediately take more big swings at the metagame. But if you were hoping for big swings, this is not going to be the OTA for you. A lot of +1 power, let's buff some older cards kind of stuff. And to be clear, I think it is, again, good that they did this. The metagame is still taking shape. It's not particularly clear what would need to be nerfed or what big swings would be justified. But generally speaking, it's also a bit below the level of excitement that I think a lot of people would have for an OTA. Now, first of all, why is there an OTA a week after a previous OTA? That is because they had a scheduling conflict, which meant that they had to do 2 OTAs in quick succession. With the previous OTA being such big swings at the metagame, this one just being let's buff some cards that a lot of people probably have is the right thing to do, I think, but it does make for a particularly dollar menu-y kind of vibe. With that said, we're going to jump into Ares, who is gaining a point of power up to 4-7. That is a fairly relevant thing for this card to have. Ares is already a card that is getting to prohibitively large amounts of power. Now he'll be a 4-13 most of the time in any deck that would bother to play him at all. I see no real issue with doing something like this in order to make Ares a more palatable card. One of the big learnings for the past week is just how bad 4 and stats is if you aren't getting a ton of synergy value out of it, or even if you aren't getting the right synergy value out of it. You look at something like Karen Page, which just came out and is widely regarded as a total flop. It's just not a card that seems particularly compelling in terms of what am I getting out of this, because as a buff support card, it doesn't work in the best versions of the buff deck and falls pretty drastically short to the ability to, say, copy a powerful buff card in your hand like what Mother Ascani gives you. At least with Ares, what you're getting is a big body, what you're playing it for is a big body, and that body being slightly bigger is all upside for you. Silver Samurai falls into the Black Bolt conversation of cards that I wouldn't really want to go out of my way to make particularly compelling in the metagame, but I'd imagine are so bad that it's probably just fine to give them a point of power and see if things shape up in a way that is particularly okay. Silver Samurai, though, it's really not an issue of what the number on him is so much as it's an issue of he is a 4-cost, and I think this is a metagame that really makes you feel the difference between a 3 and a 4-cost card, especially because the surfer-ish kind of decks, which we've established probably shouldn't be called surfer decks, but just so you get a sense of what I'm talking about, those kind of decks tend to be pretty straightforwardly using the fact that 3 costs are designed such that you can play 2 of them on the final turn of the game, where the 4 costs being unable to do that really does feel like a much more meaningful downside in a metagame like this. It's a metagame that is stressing going wide in particularly notable ways, being able to contest 2 lanes on the final turn of the game, whether that be against, the Gambit and V-Hand decks or against these kind of buff stuff decks. It's an important thing to do, and a card not really having the ability to contribute to that does make that card notably worse in the way these matchups tend to play out. As is, Silver Samurai is a cool kind of card that is probably a much safer card than Black Bolt to be one that buffs, because it's also asking something from you additionally in deck building. Like, you want to have things that Silver Samurai is hitting. It has a higher ceiling than Black Bolt, I think, because it in a really cool way, it can be a card that helps you and hurts your opponent at the same time. But I don't consider this a particularly risky or impactful change. Starhawk up to 2-3 is a little bit interesting in a world where we are playing all of this buff stuff. Unfortunately, I think that works more in theory than in practice. It can be pretty easy to look at a deck that is playing a ton of buff cards and being like, oh, I should play Starhawk in there. That's going to be really good. The problem you run into is, when am I playing Starhawk? The Storm Horseman of Famine deck has really sort of obsoleted the idea that you need to play 2-drops in your buff deck at any point. It's actually gotten to the point where even the upcoming Jeff card that looks like one of the strongest buff 2-drops we've ever had is a card that I'm not entirely sure will be making it into that deck, because Storm Horseman is such a powerful piece of what the deck is trying to do. It's a very interesting interesting question, honestly. And with all due respect to Starhawk, I've seen data mined Jeff. You, sir, are no data mined Jeff. This is a fine enough card, but getting that extra point of power is not changing the fundamentals of the fact is that my buff deck just doesn't want to do the thing that this card is doing. Cragheads, it is our time. Let's rise up. Kraglin getting a point of power. I would imagine, last time I asked, what would be a less impactful buff than Bucky Barnes to 2/2? I think we found it. I think we found the less impactful buff. The one card in the game that will affect less games, because Bucky Barnes, just by the nature of it, is going to show up in some decks with Venom and will provide one extra point of power to that Venom, where I think that Kraglin is going to show up in no decks and will provide no extra points of power. No, I mean, all seriousness, this card isn't as bad as the punchline has been made of it being, but I do think that it's a little bit off me seriously wanting to put it into my deck. But a thing that becomes a 3/8 is a lot more compelling than a thing that becomes a 3/7. And obviously, if this got up to 3/5, it would be okay, I'm actually just going to do stuff now. That is actually a card, right? I think that it's probably reasonable for them to go slow on this, but I would have liked to see them just push this to 3/5 and say, we're really doing something here. We are really just this card is going to be doing some crazy stuff. This is a card that you will want to put in your deck. This is a card that is, even though it's not necessarily able to be built around in the same way, is going to be a card that you play just for the output value. And I think 3/5 would do that. I think 3/4... if this card came out now, it might be able to, but I think the perception of this card is already at such a low ebb that I don't think this is going to meaningfully make a difference. Basically, I think that they would need to make this card go a little bit beyond what would be balanced to get people to appreciate that it is playable, because it is widely regarded as so incredibly unplayable. I do think that 3/5 would be what I would do in this spot. Zombie Captain Marvel is a card that I spent a little bit of time tooling around with, trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to buff in one of my OTAs. I ended up changing a different number on the card. I wanted to make it gain +4, which I think is a pretty aggressive buff, but more in line with what the card needs. 4/5 ain't bad. They correctly identified that this is a card that needs some help. I just don't know if they gave it enough help to actually make it be particularly exciting. Zombie Captain Marvel is held back not just by the numbers on the card, but by the sort of the unpleasant way in which activate and move to a losing location works, the heavy priority emphasis on this card. This is not a card that feels particularly good to play, and it's a card that has a bunch of confusing little interactions wrapped up in it. And I think that that is not necessarily the recipe for a card that you would want to buff to playability. So I understand why they were just let's do the smaller thing and not go whole hog on we're going to make this card really good, because if it's not a particularly fun experience to play with, you probably don't want to make it all that good. That's a pretty big lesson from Star-Lord. And I think that this is a good target for a buff. I'd have liked to see them again be a little bit more aggressive, maybe go up to 4/6, who can say? Oh, also, while I've got you here, there's this thing that pops up every so often. It's just a thing people say that I don't really know how seriously to take. But what you'll see is someone will say, they've once again learned that they have to nerf every card they put +3 on, right? And I think that that argument basically ignores half the cards in the game that say +3. People are oh, Galacta, oh, Sholau. And then it's okay, yeah, Cerebro, this, Wolverine Horseman of War, they had to buff that. It said +3. The point I want to make here is that it's not you can't put those numbers on a card. You can very easily put those numbers on a card. The problem is when those numbers are way too easily accessible. Marvel Snap is fundamentally a game that has energy and power numbers on cards. It's always going to be about the ratio between those things and not just what those numbers are. And so I'm really sick of seeing people say, well, they just can't put +3 on stuff. They can. Obviously, they can. It is a question of input versus output, not never put +3 on a card. Spider-Man Noir getting a point of power. Someone in my comments pointed out that there is a pretty compelling Wilson Fisk line with this card where you play a 1 cost, you play a 2 cost, you play Wilson Fisk, and then suddenly Spider-Man Noir is on. I think this is a very fine buff to get. I'm honestly a little surprised I haven't seen much of him in buff shells, but maybe I shouldn't be all that surprised because, you know, it's Spider-Man Noir. But there are plenty of cards that I'd like to set to 8, I can tell you that much, and that is the kind of deck that is doing the kind of like 3 multiplicative thing that might allow it to actually function. I think that largely if this card starts showing up, it'll start showing up mostly as a set the top card of my deck to 8 kind of thing. But in a deck the size of the buff decks where all your cards are that small, I could actually see this just being a thing that is worth doing. 4 or 5, set the top card of my deck to 8 is actually a fairly compelling card. I'm not saying that this buff is going to be like enough to make a bunch of people play Spider-Man Noir, but it's definitely enough to get things tickling the back of my brain and start thinking, you know, I'm kind of playing a deck where not a single card in it is bigger than 4. I'm kind of always getting value out of just setting the top card of my deck to 8 a lot of the time. You know, it's not going to play well with Mother Ascani because it's going to be on the wrong side of the hand, but not nothing. Major victory up to 3-5. Just should have happened a while ago. Glad it's happening now. I get the sense they have just like a list of things that are like, we would like to buff this. And then they just like pick 3 things off that list and put it into every OTA. And this OTA, they were like, what if we just did an OTA that was just 8 of those things? Major victory, obviously a card they should buff. Great job. Hey, look, Agent Coulson, exactly the same scenario. Agent Coulson up to 3-5. Great. Love it. Great fan, huge fan of this. Like, this is the kind of thing that these cards really actually need to make me seriously consider putting them in a deck. It's really that simple. They moved the curve effectively of Marvel Snap up significantly, right? Cyclops is a 3-5 now. Misty Knight is a 1-3 now. Just taking all these cards that released at the old vanilla stat line of like 1, 2, and 3, 4 and making them into the new kind of cards is just extremely valuable, because it means that these are now cards that are not actively embarrassing to play. That is a big deal. Like, it is a really big deal when you're talking about, like, what can I replace so-and-so with, that there are replacements that are not embarrassing. One of the biggest things Marvel Snap can do as a, like, make things easy, as a sort of balance regime that makes things easier on newer players, is reduce the gap from the best thing in a role to the second best thing in a role. You will probably not be playing Agent Coulson in any kind of like super high level tuned metagame deck, but he is a much more respectable replacement for something when he isn't actively bad stats. And that is really important. Look, I like steak, but I don't hate a dollar menu burger either. I mean, come on, look at me. You know I like the dollar menu. So largely, my take here is this is probably the exactly correct OTA for them to make, even if it's not particularly exciting. My big question is, what do I do for tomorrow? Because normally I do like day 1 decks for the new changing meta, and I don't know if anything in here is going to meaningfully affect that. I'm also really looking for a chance to get like a Wilson Fisk and Karen Page video out there. Like, what do you think actually happens here? Because, like, I could do a day 1 decks video. It would almost be more like a pre-tier list than anything else. But I think people would want that. Like, what is it that you would want out of tomorrow's video, given that this OTA is such a the kind of thing? Like, I could do like a, you know, combine the sort of day 1 decks video with like a here's what my high infinite friends are playing kind of thing. That could totally play, where it's just like, here are decks that are probably not making the tier list, but are cool. That sort of thing is sort of where my head is at. That's kind of where I'm leaning, but just let me know in the comments. As always, I'm KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.